On the morning of September 2, 1945, the most powerful battleship the United States had ever sent into combat sat perfectly still in the grey water of Tokyo Bay, with all 9 of its 16-inch guns pointed at nothing at all. Those guns could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car more than 20 miles and drop it through the deck armor of any ship afloat, and on that particular morning, they were completely, deliberately silent. The war that had consumed the entire planet for 6 years killed tens of millions of people and pulled every major nation on Earth into its gravity was about to end, and it was going to end not with a bombardment or a final desperate battle, but with 2 men, a fountain pen, and a plain table on the deck of a ship named after a state in the American heartland. The USS Missouri did not end the Second World War by firing a shot. It ended it by holding still. And to understand how a machine built for nothing but destruction became the quietest, most solemn stage in the history of the 20th century, you have to go back to the moment the world decided it needed monsters like this one at all. The Missouri was born out of fear, and specifically out of the fear of Japanese battleships. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the great naval powers of the world had lived under a series of treaties that limited how large and how numerous their warships could be. A fragile web of agreements designed to prevent the kind of ruinous arms race that had helped ignite the First World War. Battleships were the ultimate expression of national power in that era, floating fortresses that represented years of industrial effort and enormous sums of money. And the treaties capped their size and gun caliber precisely because everyone understood how dangerous an unlimited competition would be. But by the late 1930s, that system was collapsing. Japan walked away from the agreements and began building in secret, and rumors reached Washington that the Imperial Japanese Navy was constructing something unprecedented, a class of battleship larger than anything the treaties had ever allowed. Those rumors were true. The result would be the Yamato and her sister Musashi, the heaviest battleships ever built, armed with guns firing shells over 18 inches wide. The United States could not match that displacement without redesigning its entire fleet, but it could do something the Japanese giants could not. It could build something almost as powerful that was also blisteringly, impossibly fast. That decision, the choice of speed over sheer size, is the key that unlocks everything about the Missouri and the 3 sisters that shared her design. The Iowa class, of which Missouri was the 3rd to be completed, was engineered around a single obsessive requirement that seems strange until you understand the new shape of naval warfare. The admirals wanted a battleship that could keep pace with aircraft carriers. The carrier had quietly become the true ruler of the sea, its aircraft able to strike targets 100 miles beyond the horizon, while the enemy fleet was still a smudge of smoke on the edge of the world, and carriers needed to move fast to launch and recover their planes, and to run from danger. A battleship that could not keep up with them was a battleship left behind, useless as an escort, stranded in a war that had already moved on. So the designers demanded a top speed of 33 knots, roughly 38 miles per hour, which does not sound like much until you remember they were trying to push nearly 60,000 tons of steel through the water at that pace. To get there, they made the ship extraordinarily long and relatively narrow, giving her a hull that sliced through the ocean with an efficiency that heavier, blunter battleships could never achieve. Consider the raw dimensions of what they built, because the numbers only become real when you can picture them. The Missouri stretched 887 feet from bow to stern, which is nearly 3 football fields laid end to end, longer than the height of most skyscrapers you have ever stood inside. She was over 108 feet wide at her broadest point, and fully loaded for war, she displaced around 57,000 tons of water, meaning that pushing her through the sea meant shoving aside a volume of ocean equal to the weight of roughly 40,000 automobiles. Beneath her decks sat 8 enormous boilers feeding 4 steam turbines that together generated over 200,000 horsepower, turning 4 propellers, some of them more than 18 feet across, taller than a 2-story house. To imagine the force involved, picture the combined power of hundreds of ordinary cars, all channeled into spinning 4 bronze screws large enough to walk under, driving a steel island the length of 3 football fields, fast enough to outrun most of the ships that had ever existed. And she could do this while carrying enough armor and firepower to destroy nearly anything she encountered. The armor is where the philosophy of the battleship reveals itself most clearly, because it was designed around a chilling and elegant principle. A well-designed battleship was armored to survive being hit by its own guns, the assumption being that if you could not defeat your own firepower, you were probably protected against anything the enemy could throw at you. The Missouri's main armored belt, the thick steel band running along her sides at the waterline to protect the vital machinery and magazines, was over 12 inches thick, angled inward to deflect incoming shells. The faces of her gun turrets were protected by armor 17 inches thick, and the conning tower, the armored citadel from which the ship could be fought even under heavy fire, was wrapped in steel of similar thickness. This was not armor in the sense of a knight's plate. This was a moving fortress of hardened steel, weighing thousands upon thousands of tons, engineered so precisely that its designers could calculate at what range and what angle an incoming shell might penetrate, and where it would simply shatter and skate away. Every inch of that steel represented a bet about how the ship would die, and a determination to make that death as difficult as possible. But armor was the defensive half of the equation, and no one built a ship like the Missouri for defense. They built her for the 9 16-inch guns, and these weapons deserve to be understood in their full, staggering scale, because they were among the most powerful naval guns the United States ever put to sea. Each of the 3 main turrets housed 3 of these guns, and each individual gun barrel was over 66 feet long and weighed roughly 120 tons all by itself, more than a fully loaded semi-truck, and that was just the barrel. The turrets that held them were not simply the rounded shapes you see above the deck. Each turret was the visible tip of a vast rotating structure that plunged down through multiple decks into the heart of the ship, and the entire rotating assembly of a single turret, with its guns, its armor, and its machinery, weighed well over 1,000 tons, more than an entire modern destroyer. 3 of these monsters sat along the Missouri's spine, and every one of them could be swung around and aimed with a precision that seems impossible for something so heavy. The shells those guns fired are the detail that finally makes the scale land in your gut. A single armor-piercing round for the 16-inch guns weighed roughly 2,700 pounds, about the weight of a compact car, and the gun could throw that projectile more than 20 miles out past the curve of the Earth to targets the crew could not even see. To launch it, the gun burned a charge of smokeless powder assembled from 6 enormous silk bags, together weighing over 600 pounds, and the explosion drove the shell out of the barrel at roughly 2.5 times the speed of sound. When all 9 guns fired together in a full broadside, they hurled over 12 tons of steel toward the enemy in a single thunderous instant, and the recoil was so tremendous that the entire ship, all 57,000 tons of her, would shudder and slide sideways through the water. The sound was not a bang, but a physical wall that struck the body, and the pressure could shatter light bulbs and rattle fittings throughout the ship. Picture the weight of a family car flying 20 miles through the sky, 9 of them at once, launched by an explosion powerful enough to move a floating city sideways, and you begin to grasp what this ship actually was. The place where all this steel and fire came together was the New York Naval Shipyard, better known as the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where the Missouri's keel was laid down in January of 1941, in the tense final months before the United States was dragged into the war by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Building a ship of this size was one of the great industrial undertakings of the age, a project that swallowed vast quantities of steel and required thousands of workers laboring around the clock. When the Missouri finally slid down the ways into the water in January of 1944, she was christened by a young woman named Margaret Truman, the daughter of a then relatively obscure senator from Missouri named Harry Truman. That detail seems minor at the moment it happened, just a proud father and his daughter at a launching ceremony, but history was already quietly arranging its pieces. Within a year and a half, that obscure senator would be President of the United States, the man who would make the final decisions that ended the war, and the ship his daughter had christened would become the stage on which that ending was performed. The Missouri was commissioned into the Navy in June of 1944, and she went to war carrying nearly 2,700 men. Try to hold that number in your mind, because it transforms the Missouri from a machine into a place. Almost 2,700 human beings lived aboard this single ship, more people than live in many small towns, all of them packed into a steel hull less than 3 football fields long. This was a floating city with everything a city requires and no room to spare. There were bakeries producing thousands of loaves of bread a day, and a laundry washing mountains of uniforms, and a barber shop, a cobbler, a machine shop capable of manufacturing spare parts the ship could not otherwise get at sea, a chapel, a brig for prisoners, and a fully equipped medical bay with operating rooms and a dental office. The ship distilled its own fresh water from the sea, tens of thousands of gallons a day, because you cannot resupply 2,700 thirsty men in the middle of the Pacific. She generated her own electricity, enough to power a small town. Mail had to be sorted and distributed. Meals had to be served in continuous waves, because there was no space to feed everyone at once. And the cooks worked in shifts that never truly ended, feeding a population the size of a village 3 times a day, every day, for months on end without touching land. Life inside this floating city was defined by a relentless, grinding lack of space and by heat. Below the armored deck, in the engineering spaces where the boilers roared, temperatures could climb past 120 degrees, and the men who worked there, the ones who kept the ship alive, labored in a metal cavern of screaming machinery and suffocating air, their world a permanent inferno of steam and oil. Elsewhere, sailors slept in bunks stacked several high, with only inches between a man's face and the underside of the bunk above him, in compartments where the air was thick and privacy did not exist as a concept. Everything folded, stacked, or clipped away, because every cubic foot had a purpose, and yet these men built a genuine community inside that steel. They gave the ship a nickname, the Mighty Mo, spoken with the rough affection sailors reserve for a vessel they have come to trust with their lives. They developed the fierce, teasing loyalty of people who share every waking and sleeping hour in impossibly close quarters. The ship was cramped and hot and dangerous, but it was theirs, and they would come to love it in the way you can only love something that has kept you alive. When the Missouri sailed into the Pacific War in early 1945, she entered a conflict already grinding toward its brutal endgame. The great fleet battles were largely behind, and the ship's main task was to protect the aircraft carriers whose planes now delivered the decisive blows, and to use her enormous guns against targets on land. She was there off the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, where American forces fought one of the most costly battles of the entire Pacific campaign, for a scrap of island, barely 8 square miles in size, and her guns supported the men ashore. She was there for the invasion of Okinawa, the last great island battle before Japan itself, a campaign of staggering intensity that would preview just how terrible an invasion of the Japanese home islands might become. And it was off Okinawa, in April of 1945, that the Missouri met the enemy in the most personal way a battleship ever could, in an encounter that says more about that war and about the men who fought it than any statistic ever could. By that point in the war, Japan had turned to a tactic born of desperation, sending young pilots to deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships, trading a single life and a single plane for the chance to sink a vessel and kill hundreds. On the 11th of April, one of these aircraft came in low toward the Missouri, and despite the storm of anti-aircraft fire the ship threw up, it struck her along the starboard side just below the level of the main deck. The gasoline aboard the plane erupted into flame, but the ship's damage control was swift and effective. The fire was smothered, and the Missouri suffered little more than a dent in her hull and a scattering of debris. The battleship had brushed off the blow almost casually, but scattered across her deck were the remains of the young man who had flown the plane, an enemy who had just tried with everything he had to kill the entire crew. And here, the story turns into something that transcends the war entirely, because the Missouri's captain made a decision that most people would find almost incomprehensible given the circumstances. The captain ordered that the dead Japanese pilot be given a proper military burial at sea, with full honors, the same solemn ceremony the ship would give one of its own. The next day the crew assembled. A hastily improvised Japanese flag was made aboard the ship, and the body of the enemy pilot was committed to the deep with dignity. Wrapped in that flag, a rifle salute fired over him, the whole ritual observed with the gravity of respect. Some of the crew did not understand it and did not like it. This man had just tried to murder every one of them, but the captain understood something about who he wanted his men to be and who his nation was fighting to remain, even in the middle of the most savage war in human history. That pilot had been a young man following his orders and his country to his death, no less than the American boys were. And in choosing to honor him, rather than dump his body overboard in contempt, the Missouri became a symbol of something the war had not managed to burn out of the men who fought it. It is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in the ship's entire history, and it happened months before she became famous. Have you ever heard of another warship that stopped in the middle of a war to bury an enemy who had just tried to destroy it? And if that captain's decision surprises you as much as it surprises most people, tell me what you would have done in his place. As the summer of 1945 arrived, the Missouri joined the fleet in the final phase of the war, sailing close to the Japanese home islands themselves and turning her 16-inch guns against industrial targets on the mainland, striking factories and steelworks along the coast. Japan's navy had been destroyed, its air force gutted, its cities pounded from the air. And yet the war did not end because the leadership of Japan and, crucially, the willingness of its people to fight to the last were not so easily broken. American planners looked ahead to the invasion of the home islands with a dread that is difficult to overstate. Okinawa had shown what happened when Japanese forces defended their own soil, and the projections for an invasion of the main islands ran into casualty figures so appalling that the machinery of that potential campaign became a nightmare hanging over every strategic decision. It was against this backdrop, this vision of a bloodbath that might dwarf everything that had come before, that the war finally reached its sudden, shattering conclusion in August of 1945, and the Missouri received orders that would carve her name into history forever. Japan agreed to surrender, and the Allies needed a place to formalize it, a stage grand enough and secure enough to host the end of the largest war humanity had ever fought. The choice fell on the Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, and the reasons were partly practical and partly deeply symbolic. She was one of the newest and most powerful battleships in the fleet, a fitting representation of the industrial might that had won the war. And she carried the name of the home state of the President of the United States, the man in whose name the surrender would be accepted. And so, on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, the greatest concentration of naval power in the history of the world gathered in Tokyo Bay, hundreds of Allied warships filling the anchorage, while at the center of it all sat the Missouri, her decks scrubbed and her crew in their cleanest uniforms, transformed from an instrument of war into a cathedral of peace. Representatives of 9 Allied nations came aboard, along with the Japanese delegation, to sign a single document that would formally end the fighting. The details of that morning are what make it unforgettable, and they are almost all humble rather than grand, which is precisely what gives them their power. The instrument of surrender was to be signed on a table, and the ornate ceremonial table that had been arranged proved too small to hold the large documents. So at the last moment, the crew simply grabbed an ordinary mess table from the ship's crew quarters, the kind of plain table where sailors ate their meals, and covered it with a green cloth. The end of the Second World War was signed on a borrowed table off the crew's mess deck. The Japanese foreign minister, who came aboard to sign for his government, walked with great difficulty, climbing the ship's gangway on an artificial leg, a slow and painful ascent watched in silence by hundreds of sailors and officers. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, and among the Allied officers standing near him were 2 men who had themselves surrendered to the Japanese years earlier, one at the fall of Corregidor in the Philippines and one at the fall of Singapore, both of them gaunt from years in prison camps, brought to the Missouri to witness the reversal of their own defeat. MacArthur signed the document using several pens, one after another, and afterward handed those pens to those 2 liberated generals, small metal objects that now carried the weight of everything they had endured. Presiding over that gathering was a single object that closed a circle spanning almost a century, and it is perhaps the most extraordinary detail of the entire day. Mounted where everyone could see, it was an old American flag, a flag with only 31 stars, and it was not there by accident. That flag had been carried into these very waters 92 years earlier, in 1853, aboard the ships of a naval officer who had sailed a small squadron into Tokyo Bay and, through the sheer intimidating presence of his vessels, forced a reluctant and isolated Japan to open its ports to the outside world after centuries of deliberate seclusion. That single act had set in motion the long, complicated, and ultimately catastrophic collision between Japan and the West that would culminate in the Pacific War. The Navy had specifically flown that historic flag across the Pacific from a museum in the United States so that it could preside over this moment, so that the same stars and stripes that had first pried Japan open in 1853 could look down on the ceremony that ended the war those events had helped to set in motion. History rarely draws its line so cleanly, so deliberately, that the beginning and the end of a 92-year story can hang from the same piece of cloth. The ceremony itself lasted only about 23 minutes. 23 minutes to end 6 years of global war. The Japanese representatives signed, the Allied representatives signed. MacArthur spoke words expressing the hope that a better world would rise from the blood and destruction, and then, as if the sky itself had been waiting for the final signature, hundreds of American aircraft roared overhead in a massed flyover, wave after wave of carrier planes and bombers filling the air above Tokyo Bay in a demonstration of overwhelming power that needed no words. The men on the Missouri's deck looked up at that endless river of aircraft, and many of them understood in that moment that they had survived, that the thing they had been fighting and dying for since 1941 was finally truly over. The most destructive conflict in the history of the human species had ended on the deck of their ship, on a borrowed mess table, beneath a 92-year-old flag, in less time than it takes to watch a television episode. The Missouri had fired her guns in anger across the Pacific, but her most important act of the entire war was to sit perfectly still and provide a flat, solid place for the world to sign its way back to peace. You might expect the story to end there, with the ship enshrined immediately as a monument, but the Missouri's life was far from over, and the decades that followed reveal something fascinating about how the world changed around her. In the years right after the war, she remained an active warship, and when conflict broke out on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, she sailed again into combat, the first American battleship to reach Korean waters, using those same enormous 16-inch guns to bombard enemy positions along the coast in support of troops ashore. The guns that had been silent in Tokyo Bay were roaring again within 5 years, but the Missouri also had her humbling moments, the kind that remind you that even the mightiest machines are operated by human beings who make mistakes. In early 1950, in a moment of profound embarrassment, the Missouri ran hard aground in Chesapeake Bay, driving herself firmly into the mud in shallow water, where she had no business being, and it took the Navy roughly 2 weeks of intense effort to free her, an incident that made national news and turned the pride of the fleet into an object of national curiosity, stuck fast in the shallows like a beached whale. By the mid-1950s, the age of the battleship was clearly ending, and the Missouri was placed in reserve, mothballed, her crew departed, her guns wrapped and preserved, her vast interior sealed and dehumidified, tied up quietly at a pier as a relic of a bygone form of warfare. The aircraft carrier, and later the guided missile, had rendered the great gun battleship obsolete, a magnificent dinosaur in a world that had moved on to different weapons. And there she sat, year after year, for decades, a ship out of time, seemingly destined to rust away or be sold for scrap like so many of her contemporaries. But the Missouri, it turned out, was not finished. Because in the 1980s the world changed once more, and the old battleship found herself pulled back into service in a way almost no one had anticipated, given a second life that transformed her from a museum piece in waiting into a modern weapon of war once again. During the tensions of the 1980s, the United States decided to rebuild its naval strength dramatically, and someone made the striking decision to reactivate the old Iowa-class battleships, including the Missouri, and modernize them for the modern era. This was a remarkable choice, because it meant taking a ship designed in the early 1940s, before the jet engine and the guided missile and the computer had reshaped warfare, and dragging her forward 4 decades into a completely different age of combat. The engineers kept the thing that made her irreplaceable, those 9 16-inch guns that no modern ship could match for sheer destructive weight, and then they grafted onto her the weapons of the new era. They installed launchers for Tomahawk cruise missiles, precision weapons that could fly hundreds of miles and strike a target with an accuracy the old gunners could only have dreamed of. They added Harpoon anti-ship missiles and modern rapid-fire cannon systems designed to shoot down incoming missiles, and they filled her interior with modern electronics and radar. The result was one of the strangest and most formidable warships in the world, a vessel with the massive armored hull and colossal guns of the Second World War, carrying the guided missiles of the late 20th century, the past and the present welded together into a single fighting ship. And so it happened that the Missouri, the ship that had ended one war, went to fight in another one nearly half a century after her launching. When conflict came in the Persian Gulf in 1991, the Missouri sailed into action once more, and she fired both of her ages of weaponry in the same campaign. She launched Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets deep inland, guided modern weapons streaking off toward their objectives, and she also brought those enormous 16-inch guns back into action, hurling those 2,700-pound shells at enemy positions along the coast, the last time in history that guns of that size would be fired in anger by anyone, anywhere. In a single deployment, she reached back to the technology of the 1940s and forward to the technology of the 1990s. There was even a moment during that campaign when an enemy anti-ship missile was launched toward the Missouri, and it was intercepted and destroyed by a missile fired from an Allied British warship sailing nearby, a piece of teamwork that saved the old battleship from harm in her final war. The ship that had been christened by a future president's daughter in 1944 was still fighting and still being protected by her companions in 1991. After that final campaign, the Missouri's active career truly came to an end. The great gun battleship had reached the absolute limit of its usefulness in a world that had fully embraced the missile and the aircraft as the arbiters of naval power, and she was decommissioned for the last time in the early 1990s, her long and improbable fighting life finally over after nearly 5 decades. She had been present at the end of the Second World War, fought in Korea, been mothballed for a generation, been reborn in the 1980s and gone to war one last time in the Persian Gulf. Few ships in history have lived through so many distinct eras of warfare, spanning from a world of iron and gunpowder to a world of guided missiles and computers, all within a single hull. And when it came time to decide what to do with her, the Navy made a choice that would give the Missouri her final and perhaps most meaningful role, one that connects everything about her story into a single, unbroken circle. The Missouri was preserved as a museum ship, and she was brought to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, to the very place where the Pacific War had begun for the United States, and there she was moored in a position of profound and deliberate symbolism. Because Pearl Harbor is also home to the memorial that marks where the war started, the sunken hull of the battleship Arizona, destroyed in the surprise attack of December 1941, with over 1,000 of her crew still entombed within her, a grave and a shrine that draws millions of visitors who come to stand in silence above the men who died there. And the Missouri was positioned so that she looks out over that sunken memorial, the mighty battleship, keeping a permanent watch over the resting place of the ship whose destruction dragged America into the war. The Arizona marks the beginning, the Missouri marks the end. The place where the war began for America and the ship on whose deck the war ended now sit within sight of one another in the same harbor, bookending the entire Pacific conflict. The sorrow of the opening and the solemn relief of the closing joined together across the water. A visitor can stand on the Arizona Memorial in the morning, looking down at the beginning of it all, and then walk the deck of the Missouri in the afternoon, standing on the exact spot where it ended. That is where you can find her today, and if you ever walk her decks, you can stand on the precise place where the surrender was signed, marked now by a simple plaque set into the steel, and you can look out across the water toward the Arizona and feel the entire arc of that war compressed into the space between two ships. You can see the dent in her hull from the aircraft that struck her off Okinawa, and hear the story of the enemy pilot her captain chose to bury with honor. You can stand beneath the 16-inch guns and try to comprehend that each one could throw a shell the weight of a car more than 20 miles, and that when all 9 fired at once, the entire 57,000-ton ship slid sideways through the sea. You can walk through the cramped berthing spaces where 2,700 men lived stacked in bunks, through the bakery and the machine shop and the medical bay of a floating city, and understand that this monument was also, once, simply home to thousands of ordinary young men. The Missouri is no longer a weapon. She has become a place where the 20th century holds still long enough for you to touch it. And here is the thing that should stay with you when you leave her. The reason the Missouri matters beyond the guns and the tonnage and the records. Every peace treaty you have ever heard of, every ceasefire, every moment when leaders sit down and sign their names to end a conflict, follows the same fundamental logic as what happened on that borrowed mess table in Tokyo Bay. Wars are not truly ended by the last shot fired. They are ended by human beings choosing to stop, formalizing that choice with something as fragile and civilized as ink on paper, agreeing to be bound by words rather than weapons. The most powerful battleship America ever built spent its most important moment not destroying anything, but simply providing a flat and solid surface for that most human of acts. The Missouri reminds us that the deepest strength is not the ability to obliterate, but the discipline to stop, and that even a machine engineered for nothing but war can become, at the right moment, the quietest and most hopeful place on Earth. The guns that fell silent in Tokyo Bay have never spoken in a world war since, and that silence, more than any broadside, is the Missouri's true legacy. If this journey through the life of the mighty Mo showed you something about that war you had never quite pictured before, from the enemy pilot buried with honor to the 92-year-old flag that presided over the surrender, then consider subscribing so the next great ship, the next lost city, the next reconstructed world can find its way to you, and pass this story along to someone who thinks they already know how the Second World War ended, because almost no one knows it ended on a borrowed table beneath a flag that had waited 92 years to come home.